Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme today we'll be asking why this government should not adopt the Australian and New Zealand model of zero Covid-19. So to join me in this programme today, I'm joined by Tim Dieppe, who's Head of Public Policy at Christian Concern, together with David Curtin, who is the leader of the Heritage Party. So gentlemen, welcome back to the programme.
Thank you.
I'll start off with you, David, because we thought we had it bad in the UK with the lockdowns, but it seems that Australia and New Zealand have become fortresses, and their policy of driving COVID out and adopting a zero COVID-19 policy is bringing their nations into ruin, not alone threatening the very liberties of the Australian and New Zealand people. What is your assessment of what's happening in this part of the world?
Yeah, well, we did have it bad in the UK, absolutely. We remember that, but now we're slightly freer here. But in Australia and New Zealand, they've forged ahead with restrictions. And what we saw now has been put in place even more harshly in Australia with the attack on civil liberties. The economy is almost completely closed down. You can't go into the country. They've even closed the borders between states. And you have the president or premier of Victoria State. He's become notorious, Dan Andrews, for making these statements like, you shouldn't go and meet your friends, or if you want to go and see the sunset, don't go and see the sunset, stay at home, that's bad for you. I mean, this is complete insanity coming from political leaders of the country, but more the individual states in Australia, because they seem to have the authority over the health policy and the COVID policy. But it's utterly destructive, and I think we're looking on in horror at what's happening there, and also that's being backed up with horrendous brutality by the police of anyone who actually just exercises their normal civil liberties, goes out on the streets to protest or meet other people.
And where do you think it's going wrong, Tim, for Australia? Because Australia and New Zealand were lifted up as the model examples of countries in tackling COVID-19. The Australians and New Zealand were the first to lock their borders. They were the first ones to stop flights from Australia to China. Then they completely closed off their borders completely, and then immersed in a very, very harsh lockdown, which seemed to be working for a little bit. But now it seems that their policy of zero COVID-19, of wanting to eradicate it completely, is just madness and having a huge damaging impact, not only on
Simon, I think you could have said even back at the original time when people were lauding Australia and New Zealand as doing really well, I think you could have said, no, this is obviously not going to work, because you can't maintain a zero COVID strategy, because what you can do, lock the borders forever. You can't do that. Are you going to keep in lockdown forever and stop everyone going outside forever? You can't do it. So at some point they're going to have to wake up and realise that this is not practical. It can't work. You can't just control the economy and control everyone and restrict civil liberties forever. I mean, one of the most shocking things about this is how popular it actually is to sort of shut everyone in and lock everyone behind doors and say, don't go out, stay inside, don't take your dog for a walk, don't go to school, don't meet your friends, all this kind of stuff. And it's remarkably popular, and it shows how much fear can influence people, and fear is what can be used then to control people and say don't do things and restrict people's liberties. And that's what's happened to an extraordinary degree, and really extraordinary in both Australia and New Zealand, I think.
Yeah. And David, it's also interesting to know the way that the Australian government has set things up, which is a very confusing way of dealing with things. So on the one hand, we see that each state in Australia has its own chief medical officer, and each state is responsible for its own healthcare together with the federal healthcare. So there seems to be huge amounts of power given to each state to adopt any policy that they want. But it seems absolutely ridiculous that people can't travel from one state or another, or if there's a case of 60 cases of COVID in one city, they'll completely lock down the entire city. without looking at the mental health, not looking at the economic devastation this is causing. What do you think the Australians in particular are pursuing such a policy as this? Is it because they're a big island and they feel like they are disconnected from the world and that they can protect themselves from COVID-19, considering that they've only had 1,000 people die of COVID, and considering that 3,000 people die a week in Australia alone, and they've only had 100 deaths this year? What are they so scared about?
I think like here and like many places in the world, they have been scared to death by psychological propaganda. You know, in the UK, everyone's familiar with SAGE, this group that advises the UK government that has got behavioural psychologists in it, which put out advertising and put out messages on the media to ramp up the fear. Well, the same is happening in Australia, but it's like what's happening here in the UK on steroids. You know, the messages that are coming through the media, through the political leaders, and in this situation where you've got the 6 different states and the Northern Territories as well, so 7 different governments and health ministers putting out different messages, leads to the confusion. It causes the confusion. So this again disorientates the population, because you see something happening in one place and it's a bit harsher, and then another place it's a bit easier, but then things change and swing around. But I mean, in general, they are pursuing this zero COVID policy. It's the wrong strategy. I mean, I've been speaking about this from the very beginning. What Sweden did, we all know, was they allowed everyone just to carry on as normal, said, look, if you want to wear a mask, wear a mask. If you want to social distance, do social distancing. But they didn't force anyone to do anything. And the real observed data shows that there was no difference in the path of the epidemic in Sweden, which had very, very few restrictions, and countries that had severe restrictions. There was no difference. The virus took its course and did what it wanted to do. So all Australia and New Zealand have done is delay the inevitable for a year, or maybe a year and a half. Now there are cases, but I mean, that's debatable as well, the PCR test. I mean, there's a lot we can say about that, and the false positives and the, meaninglessness of some of the results of PCR testing. But that's used again to ramp up the fear, which goes with the behavioural psychology. So they're just frightening their population, and it's looking like they're destroying their country's economy and civil liberties for whatever reason on purpose people have behind the scenes for doing that.
And also, we see that, for example, the United States had the same comparison between a very liberal Florida and a very harsh California with harsh measures, and the results were virtually the same. So that survey works in the States as well. Tim, I know that Christian Concern, and we've done a programme on this one, winning that landmark religious freedom case up in Scotland to prevent churches from being locked down. But what message have got anyone who's watching the programme from Australia or New Zealand today and are concerned about their Christian freedoms to actually go to church and worship God under these extreme COVID-19?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we were most concerned right back at the beginning in the original lockdown in March was that churches were considered non-essential. So you had certain things that were considered essential, supermarkets, doctors, but even bicycle shops and off licenses were essential, but worshipping God is not essential. And there's a massive breach of freedom of religion there. And we sent a letter before action to the government around this and threatened judicial review. The government backed down and allowed churches to open again. Then they put us in lockdown again. So then we went back to court again, and then they opened up again, and then Scotland continued to keep churches closed back in January, and we went to court about that and won the case. And it set a remarkable precedent. The Scottish government had breached both human rights law and the Constitution in closing churches and refusing people to meet together to worship and pray together. And that, I think, means the government won't do that again and won't be able to do that again, even if there is, hopefully, God forbid, not a third lockdown here. But there we are in Australia, is what, the 6th lockdown or something? And in New Zealand, there's lockdown as well. And I know the churches are prohibited from meeting in New Zealand in certain areas, and I think perhaps in Australia in certain areas as well. So far, there's been no legal action, as far as I'm aware, about that. But We've been talking to some pastors in New Zealand about this and talking to some people in Australia as well about this, and I hope that they will take inspiration from the case that we ran, a similar constitution, obviously the same human rights kind of laws and so on, and we've got all our legal documents are online for everyone to see and look at on our website, and they can see that the case for governments acting illegally in terms of refusing people to worship is very strong. And I think this was actually the only case that was won against the government's coronavirus regulations here in the UK.
And David, what's extraordinary is that the Australian federal government, for example, not only sealed off the country to the outrage of Australians outside of the country, but they also banned anyone from leaving the country without permission of the government. And this is a real threat to civil liberties. This is in violation of the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. And also find that if you're an Australian, you find yourself wanting to go home, and particularly with COVID-19, with lockdowns and everything else, if you're in a foreign country, you're away from your family and your friends, it can be a very isolating experience. So it's only natural to think, okay, I want to fly home, but the government has then imposed almost a $3,000 quarantine hotel room that you've got to stay in for 14 days, which many Australians find that very, very difficult to afford. And then because it's state controlled, as you said earlier, that you can have one family live in one state of Australia and then live in another state, but they can't visit each other because those states are in lockdown.
Yeah, right, and they're a long way away from each other. If you want to go, if you're in Western Australia and you want to visit someone in Queensland, that's a long way to go. Yeah, I mean, you would think, even if this was a really dangerous disease, which it's not, for most people, you would think that, there'd be no problem with people leaving the country to go somewhere else. There's no reason to restrict people from leaving. I mean, this is almost like a communist era restriction. It's got no basis there's no logical, rational reason to do that. But stopping people from coming into the country, if they're healthy, there's no reason to do that. I mean, this is for the people who get it, especially at the beginning. It's a serious illness. It killed some people, but 99.85% of people approximately survive. So it's only the same mortality rate as in a normal flu season. And the average age of people who did die, sadly, was 83. I think in this country is similar in Australia. So it's not something that's out of the ordinary from any other flu season year whatsoever. I mean, the Hong Kong flu season 1968, 1969 was worse than in 2020. So there's no reason whatsoever to have these restrictions. Yeah, exactly. This is about something different, I think, which you might want to get into, but I think this is about trying to get everyone ultimately to get vaccinated and then to get vaccine passports, which is coming in, and we might go on to talk about the World Economic Forum and their plans. I'm sure people are aware that that's what they want to do. They're very open about this. They want ID cards as well. Want to get people digital ID and social credit system. So that's the real reason for this. And I think that's the real reason why they're pushing it and doing things which are seemingly irrational. But when you understand that's the goal of everything, you can see that's why they're doing things.
And Tim, why do you think that these extreme lockdowns that we're seeing in Australia that are popular with so many Australians? Because without kind of popular support, no government can actually implement these things.
Well, it's back to fear, isn't it? It's back to people are afraid, people have been persuaded that it is a very deadly, dangerous disease. And as David's just articulated, it's not really that deadly and dangerous for most people. If some people who feel vulnerable want to hide away, I think that's fine, that's their right. But you shouldn't force everyone, regardless of health or age or whatever, to hide away and lock down all the time. And that's very, very damaging for the economy. But people have been cowed into fear. They're very, very terrified about this, in spite of actually very low death rates in Australia from it, and actually quite low case rates as well. It's not actually killing a huge numbers of people in Australia. It hasn't killed lots of people in Australia. Hope it won't. But but they can't just keep it at bay like this forever. Even with the vaccine, if you want to vaccinate people, fine, great. But the vaccine doesn't actually stop people catching it or stop them passing it on. It does reduce hospitalisations, which is a good thing, but doesn't stop the spread of the disease. So, you know, at some point you've got to say, you know, enough is enough, and we need to let people live.
And David, according to my notes here, that the Australian chief scientists believe that that no one else should meet anyone else as a way of stopping the spread of this contagious disease. So that's their recommendation, that people shouldn't meet with each other. And we know that human interaction is so important, but also in terms of kind of Christian context, fellowship with one another is so vital to encourage each other. But this is just wanting to conduct a policy of isolation. The fact is that Australian school children, for example, have had 27 weeks of school because of these lockdown restrictions. What do you think is going to be the damage in terms of people's mental health, lack of education, let alone job opportunities, and could really plunge Australia and New Zealand into being third world states?
It's damaging to society across the board. I mean, when you say to people they shouldn't meet each other, I mean, this is what people need to do every day. I mean, you know, seeing people, smiling at people, hugging people, shaking people's hands, they're all part of everyday interaction, which we need, you know, to boost our spirits. It gives us endorphins, it gives us oxytocin, it gives us endorphins, these, you know, chemical reactions and responses to that raise our spirits and so on. To try to isolate people from others so we don't have normal interaction, it's at the very least absolutely depressing to everybody, and then it was going to cause huge mental health issues, as you said, particularly to people who are already suffering, and children who are growing up, who need to be with each other, to socialise, to play, to, you know, learn together. I mean, so that's going to cause, you know, in the future, a dearth of skills. You know, they're going to de-skill their children. They're going to fall behind other countries. And, you know, countries like China, who are now, you know, just acting as normal, are going to be laughing, because they're going to race ahead of Australia in terms of their economic power. You know, so this is just something that's going to crash the economy as well as destroy people's mental health across the board. It's very, very bad.
And children's education is so important, isn't it? I mean, I can't begin to think that the school children in Australia, I don't know what New Zealand's example is, but to be off school for 27 weeks is going to be incredibly damaging to a child's personal development, their educational development, and not having that interaction with other children to play with as well. It is going to almost create lifetime emotional scars, is it not? As well as
and the other thing, of course, it makes them addicted to screens, right? Because the whole method of teaching, if there is such that can be done, is all through screens. So you spend your entire time looking at screens, the extent you do any learning in the lockdown, and there's no actual personal interaction, which children and all of us need every day. It's very, very bad for their mental health. You know, there's no way of really controlling the children from distractions online or messages online, all of that kind of stuff that comes through all the time. It's very, very damaging and very hard for them to learn efficiently, and any teacher will tell you it's much better to teach in person and much more efficient and effective, and you build a relationship, but there's no relationship building with the kids. There's no friendship building either with the kids, and it's very, very difficult, particularly if you start a new school, you don't know anybody else there. You don't know who your new friends are. You don't know who your friends are not. You don't know any of the teachers. You've got no established relationship. It's really very, very difficult. And I just hope and actually, of course, the risk to children is very, very low from this disease. You know, they might be slightly ill for a little bit, but that's all. You know, so really, I hope that they open up the schools again for children in Australia, because it's really very damaging for them to keep them closed like this.
Absolutely. So according to a couple of weeks ago, across the country, this is in Australia, there are some 800 cases, and 2/3 of Australians, that's some 18 million people, are now in lockdown, and very, very extreme lockdown where people's movements are restricted. Schools are closed, most shops are closed except for supermarkets and chemists. It's a pretty miserable kind of existence living like this, is it not?
Yeah, of course it is. And again, cases here, you got to define what that actually means properly. So when they say a case, is this someone who actually has symptoms? Probably not. They're probably people who've had a positive PCR test, wouldn't have any symptoms at all. So we know, even the World Health Organization says that PCR tests done on a high number of thermal cycles, over 24 thermal cycles, are meaningless. And these are being done with a much higher level of thermal cycles than that. So I don't, listen to the PCR test case numbers at all. To me, they're just completely useless. So you've got to look at who actually has symptoms of COVID, where they actually do have the signs of the disease, and that the numbers of that are going to be far lower than the number of people with PCR tests. So to lock down 18 million people on the basis of 800 PCR tests is absolutely crazy. There's no reason for it whatsoever.
And Tim, we see that our own government has decided to go against, thankfully, this policy of wanting to pursue a zero COVID-19 policy. I think maybe some of the Welsh or the Scottish assemblies might have done the same if it had not been for the UK government and Parliament in London. But we also see that the Republic of Ireland also adopted something very similar. And considering the state of their economies, this is kind of bad news. So why do you believe that our government in particular has decided not to adopt the Australian-New Zealand approach and rely on more on herd immunity and mass vaccinations?
Well, I think that we've had many more cases, haven't we, than Australia and New Zealand. We've had many more deaths and hospitalisations, and actually we've coped with it, right? And we've had, 2 peaks now, and we've coped, we've managed. Obviously it's not nice, any death or any hospitalisation, but we've coped, we've managed. It's not been terrible. There's not been, people out on the streets or whatever. And so I think there's a realisation that actually we can cope with this. It's survivable. It's all right. It's not like Ebola or something incredibly deadly and infectious, this disease. It's something much more like a flu disease that people have got. And I think the government's also realising the cost. At one point, more than 50% of people in the country were in the government's pay because of furlough. And you can't just keep paying. People think that the government's got a magic money tree. Well, it's actually yours and my money paying through tax, and then it's borrowing more and more money, which one day people have to pay back. And we're giving our children a huge inheritance of debt doing this, and we can't just live off debt forever because one day it'll come home to hit us. So I think the government realised all of these things and decided, that we should open up, and I'm grateful that they have. I'm concerned that as we get into winter, and there'll undoubtedly be another flu season in the winter, which may be mixed with some COVID as well. I'm concerned that they'll do some more draconian measures there, and they've kept vaccine passports off the agenda for now, but not ruled it out. And I'm concerned about that as well in terms of freedom, religious freedom and personal freedom as well. But I'm hopeful that we won't go back there at the moment. And of course, the cases aren't spiralling out of control at the moment as we've been opened up.
Yeah. And David, if we look at the Australian national debt now, according to Alexander Downer, who writes in The Spectator, an excellent article which I based the programme on called Fortress Oz, he says that the now national debt is heading towards 40% of GDP in Australia, that state governments are also in huge debt, and Australia is on the verge of $1 trillion of debt because of its COVID-19 zero policy. And many people don't actually look at the serious economic consequences of such actions, and the fact that this is devastating the Australian economy should actually wake up Australians, shouldn't it? Because you need to protect yourselves from COVID, absolutely, but once COVID goes or is immersed with other flus and everything else and becomes a less of a threat, then the devastation of this economic devastation could actually last for decades.
Yeah, you would hope that people would think about this, but the media is the gatekeeper of information. So if they're not talking about the debt, then people are not so aware of that. And people are just thinking about how do we survive from day to day? How do we get our food? How do we, live when we haven't got a job, when we can't see our families? So there's all these stresses that are put onto people to get people thinking about these things. So they don't think about the bigger picture, that the national economy is going down the tubes. And, you mentioned 40% of GDP. That would probably be as a percentage of what the GDP was before COVID. But GDP would have gone down and down. So, probably the percentage of debt will be much higher than that. $1 trillion for Australia. I mean, that's a huge amount of money, really. You think, how on earth are they going to pay that back? You get to a certain level, and then it becomes impossible to ever pay back your debt, like Greece has found just recently. They've gone over 100% debt to GDP ratio, so they'll never get out of that. I hope that Australia pulls back from the brink and starts working again and is thrusting forward again economically, but it's not going to if it continues on this course that it's going at the moment.
And Tim, we're down to the last 2 minutes of the programme, but I need to add that one of Australia's biggest economic trades is tourism, and the fact that 9.5 million tourists haven't visited Australia since COVID-19 is devastating for the Australian economy. But in summing up, how can we stand with our brothers and sisters in Christ in Australia and New Zealand who are suffering under their government's policy of wanting to bring about zero COVID-19?
Well, I'd say to them that they need to speak out about this. They need to talk about it. They need to point to other countries like the UK and other countries which are opening up, and other states as well. They're opening up and say, look, it's not so bad to open up. It's not such a disaster. The countries are carrying on and their economy is doing rather better and they're not going into so much debt, and point people and tell people that, and then tell people to get over the fear. Right? Somehow you've got to get over the fear of this and decide, actually, life is more important and we need to not be cowed into frightening everyone away. And do look at our case on the churches opening up and copy it and bring a case against the government on this, because things have got to change here.
And David, with you as well, any plans to set up a Heritage Party franchise in Australia and New Zealand and, to actually preserve religious freedom? Because we know that when governments take away our personal liberties, it's very, very hard to get them back. You've got 20 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to do that. I mean, I'd definitely like to work with similar parties around the world. I think there is one in New Zealand. I've spoken to the people and leaders in that party. So that's fantastic. This movement is global for freedom, and it's going to happen everywhere.
So David, Tim, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's Politics Today. You've done a great job.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you for watching this programme today. We can see with the cases in Australia and New Zealand with their zero COVID-19 strategy that it's an absolute disaster, and how we're not in their situation. But we also need to pray and stand with our brothers and sisters in Christ in Australia and New Zealand and tell them not to be fearful, but to stand on the Word of God and to stand in the grace of God and in His peace. So I want to thank you for watching this edition of Politics Today.